A predator does not concern itself with the dreams of its prey, especially when that prey is fast asleep in the endless freezing dark of the cosmos. For the Valyrian Empire, humanity was nothing more than a minor curiosity, an unrefined species of soft-skinned laborers meant to be harvested and put to use. High above the galactic plane, skimming the absolute fringes of the Milky Way, the Imperial dreadnought Ethelgard prowled through the stellar dust. It was a vessel of terrifying beauty, its sweeping golden hull gleaming with the energy of captive plasma sails. Designed as much for psychological domination as for absolute military superiority, Commander Vael stood on the primary observation deck, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Tall, slender, and clad in the ceremonial crystalline armor of the Valyrian aristocracy. Vael possessed 4 eyes that currently narrowed with deep, restless ambition. His political standing back in the Imperial Senate was precarious. Rival lords were securing vast territories and subjugating entirely new species, bringing immense wealth and prestige to their houses. Vael, confined to border patrol duty in this desolate sector, desperately needed a monumental victory to secure his seat among the High Lords. He required a prize that would make the Emperor himself take notice. His opportunity arrived unannounced, drifting silently on the long-range scanners like a ghost ship. The censor officer, a subordinate of a lesser caste, bowed deeply before approaching Vael's command throne. He reported a massive, unregistered vessel lumbering through the void on a highly inefficient trajectory. It possessed no military transponder codes, no escorts, and broadcasted only a repetitive automated navigation signal. Vael ordered the Ethelgard to close the distance and bring the visual feed to the main holographic projector. The image that materialized in the center of the bridge was an aesthetic offense to the Valyrian sensibilities. The alien ship was a colossal brutalist wedge of dark gray metal, devoid of any elegant curvature or artistic grace. It was completely utilitarian, marred by thick armor plating, exposed thruster banks, and towering communication arrays that looked painfully primitive. Vael sneered at the crude design, reading the jagged, primitive symbols painted on the hull. Tartarus. The ship registry marked it as a vessel originating from Earth. Vael consulted the Imperial intelligence databases regarding human activity in this sector. The data was sparse but clear. Earth was an overpopulated industrial world. They frequently launched massive, slow-moving colony ships to establish agricultural outposts on distant, habitable moons. These seed ships were legendary for their massive holds, packed tightly with thousands of docile, desperate farmers seeking a better life, kept in cryogenic suspension to survive the long journey. A cold, arrogant smile touched Vael's lips. An unescorted agricultural hauler. It was a gift from the cosmos. A single ship containing tens of thousands of able-bodied laborers. Taking them as slaves would provide an immediate, massive influx of free labor to the Empire's hazardous plasma foundries. Presenting such a staggering bounty to the Senate would not merely salvage Vael's political career. It would instantly elevate him to a position of supreme influence. He gave the order to intercept and prepare boarding parties. The golden dreadnought surged forward, effortlessly matching the slow, agonizing pace of the Tartarus. Energy tethers lashed out from the Ethelgard, striking the human vessel's thick hull and locking it firmly in place. Magnetic boarding tubes extended like the jaws of a viper, attaching securely to the primary airlocks of the dark, silent ship. Vael dispatched his elite sentinels. They were heavily armed strike teams encased in sleek, obsidian combat suits, wielding high-yield plasma rifles. They moved with absolute precision, expecting a chaotic scene of panicked, half-awake colonists wielding makeshift tools in a futile attempt to defend their transport. Instead, they found a chilling emptiness. The heavy airlock doors gave way with a violent hiss of equalizing pressure. The Valerian strike team poured into the Tartarus, their weapons raised, only to be met with dimly lit corridors bathed in the red glow of emergency power. There were no frantic human defenders. There were no alarms blaring. The ship was eerily quiet, save for the low, rhythmic thrum of the immense sublight engines deep within its bowels. The strike team leader relayed the visual feed directly to Vael's command throne. The Valerians marched through wide, utilitarian hallways, stepping over thick bundles of exposed cables and passing by primitive, clunky service drones. The automated machines completely ignored the heavily armed alien invaders, mindlessly continuing their programmed maintenance routes. Vael watched the feed with growing amusement, quietly insulting the pathetic security measures of the human race. They relied entirely on the emptiness of space to hide them. The boarding party reached the central cargo bays. The security doors here were incredibly thick, designed to withstand internal explosive decompression, but they proved no match for the Valerian plasma torches. As the heavy steel doors finally parted, a wave of freezing air rolled over the alien soldiers. The visual feed transmitted back to the Ethelguard revealed the true, staggering scale of Vael's prize. The cargo bay stretched for miles. It was a cathedral of ice and steel. Stacked in perfectly organized, towering rows were thousands upon thousands of heavy cryogenic stasis pods. The thick glass of the viewing panes was coated in a dense layer of frost, obscuring the faces of the humans trapped in a deep, dreamless sleep. Glowing amber lights pulsed rhythmically on the side of each unit, confirming that the life support metrics of the cargo were perfectly stable. Vael leaned forward, his ambition completely intoxicating him. The sheer volume of raw labor sitting defenseless before him was beyond his most optimistic calculations. He immediately ordered his engineering divisions to deploy heavy gravity lifters. There was no need to wake the humans here and risk any unnecessary logistical complications. They would simply transfer the entire payload, pods and all, directly into the massive holding bays of the Ethelguard. For the next several hours, the void between the two ships was a highway of stolen cargo. Massive automated lifters ferried blocks of 50 cryopods at a time through the wide boarding tubes. The Valerian crew worked with meticulous efficiency, stacking the heavy human chambers deep within the fortified lower decks of the dreadnought. Vael observed the operation from the bridge, swirling a chalice of luminous blue wine. His mind was already light years away, rehearsing the grand speech he would deliver to the Imperial Senate, imagining the envious glares of his aristocratic rivals as he unveiled his immense new workforce. He felt untouchable. He had executed a flawless capture without shedding a single drop of Valerian blood. He severed the energy tethers, leaving the completely emptied, silent husk of the Tartarus to drift aimlessly into the endless dark. As the Ethelguard re-engaged its primary drives and shifted its course back toward Imperial space, Vael issued his final order for the cycle. He commanded the lower deck wardens to prepare the plasma foundries and begin the thawing sequence for the first block of cryogenic pods. He was eager to see his new, docile farmers put their hands to work. He did not know that his golden dreadnought had just swallowed a poison pill. Awakening from cryo-sleep feels like clawing your way out of a frozen grave. But waking up to find hostile alien creatures staring through the glass is an entirely different kind of nightmare. For the passengers of the Tartarus, however, nightmares were simply a way of life. Deep within the armored bowels of the Ethelguard, far below the pristine observation decks and crystal chandeliers of the command bridge, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and burning fuel. The lower holds housed the dreadnought's plasma foundries, a brutal industrial sector where immense energies were channeled to power the ship's weapons. It was a place of blinding heat and lethal radiation, the perfect environment to break the spirit of newly acquired slave labor. Vael's wardens, a caste of heavily armored overseers wielding crackling energy pikes, stood in a wide perimeter around the first block of 50 cryogenic pods. They activated the revival sequence with a series of sharp, authoritative keystrokes on their wrist-mounted consoles. They expected a chaotic spectacle. They anticipated weeping, confusion, and the fragile limbs of agricultural workers collapsing under the gravity of a foreign warship. The wardens gripped their weapons tighter, eager to administer the first harsh lessons of imperial obedience. The thick layers of frost on the heavy glass panes began to melt, turning into small rivers of water that pooled on the metal grating below. The amber life support lights shifted to a harsh, steady green. With a heavy mechanical groan, the pressure seals disengaged. The heavy blast doors of the pods slid upward, venting dense clouds of supercooled nitrogen into the sweltering heat of the foundry. The wardens stepped forward, weapons raised, ready to corral the frightened herd. They froze. The figures stepping out of the dissipating white fog were not soft-skinned farmers. They did not cower. They did not scream. They emerged with an eerie, coordinated silence, their bare feet hitting the metal deck with heavy, deliberate thuds. The Valyrian guards lowered their pikes a fraction of an inch, their four eyes blinking in absolute confusion at the anatomical anomalies standing before them. These humans were massive, their bodies corded with dense, hyper-developed muscle mass. Their skin was a canvas of extreme violence, crisscrossed with jagged blast burns, crude kinetic tattoos, and the unmistakable symmetrical silver scars of military-grade neural implants. Some had entire limbs replaced with dull, heavy-duty cybernetics that looked perfectly designed for crushing bone. They stood dripping with viscous stasis fluid, their chests heaving as they dragged the hot, metallic air into their lungs, their eyes scanning the alien wardens with cold, predatory calculation. Stepping from the center pod was Silas Vance. He was not the largest man in the room, but his presence carried a distinct, terrifying gravity. Vance was a former Grand Tactician for Earth's United Defense Front, a man who had orchestrated the collapse of entire planetary governments before a fabricated treason charge landed him a triple life sentence in the absolute dark. He wiped the freezing gel from his eyes, his mind already operating at 1,000 miles an hour. He did not look at the alien creatures pointing weapons at him. He looked past them. He calculated the blast radius of the plasma conduits running along the ceiling. He measured the exact distance to the primary security doors. He noted the slight nervous tremor in the hands of the alien guards holding the energy pikes. 2 pods to his left. Elena Rostova stepped out onto the deck. She moved with the fluid, utterly silent grace of a ghost. Before her incarceration, Rostova was the apex of Earth's Black Operations Division, a lethal phantom who specialized in dismantling heavily fortified targets from the inside out. Her eyes pale and completely devoid of empathy, locked onto Vance. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between them. No panic, total situational awareness. The head warden, sensing the disturbing lack of fear in his new acquisitions, decided to assert dominance. He stepped forward, raising his crackling pike high, and shouted a harsh, guttural command in the Valyrian tongue. To emphasize his point, he slammed the butt of his weapon against the steel deck, sending a shower of blue sparks into the air. The 50 hardened criminals, warlords, and sociopaths of Cell Block Alpha did not flinch. A few of them actually smiled. Vance cracked his neck, the sound echoing sharply in the tense silence. He turned to face the towering, four-eyed alien warden, his expression utterly devoid of intimidation. He then looked over his shoulder at a heavily scarred man who used to run a cartel on the Martian colonies. "Looks like the Transit Authority downgraded our luxury suite, gentlemen," Vance said, his voice a dry, gravelly baritone that cut perfectly through the oppressive heat of the room. "And the bellhops are completely lacking in basic hospitality." A low, rumbling chuckle rippled through the group of inmates. It was a dark, dangerous sound. Vance had just shifted the power dynamic in the room with a single sentence. He gave the heavy hitters a focal point, a reason to hold their ground and wait for the signal, rather than launching into a disorganized, suicidal brawl. Vance turned his attention back to the alien wardens. He analyzed their crystalline armor, noting the unshielded joints at the knees and the throat. He looked at the massive automated lifters still humming in the background, realizing how they had been brought aboard. The truth hit him like a physical blow, and he had to suppress a genuine smile. These alien aristocrats had no idea what they had just done. They thought they had ambushed a slow-moving civilian transport, a pathetic herd of sheep ripe for the slaughter. They had absolutely no concept of human penal codes, no understanding of the Tartarus Project. The registry was a ghost, the ship an unmarked tomb designed to hold the absolute worst monsters humanity had ever produced, banished to the farthest, darkest corner of the galaxy where they could never harm Earth again. The Valyrian Empire had not captured a petting zoo. They had just dragged a maximum security black site directly into the soft, vulnerable underbelly of their flagship. And now, the cages were open. The head warden, infuriated by the humans' lack of submission, leveled his plasma pike directly at Vance's chest. The weapon hummed with lethal energy, illuminating Vance's cold, calculating eyes. The warden barked another unintelligible order, gesturing violently toward the heavy doors leading deeper into the plasma foundries. The message was clear. Move or burn. Vance did not move. He stood his ground, letting the tension stretch until it was practically suffocating. He needed to know how the rest of the ship functioned, how the command structure communicated, and exactly what kind of lethal force these elegant creatures were willing to use when pushed into a corner. He needed a test. He glanced at Rostova, giving her the briefest, almost imperceptible nod. The game had officially begun, and the board was completely in their favor. How long would it take for the wardens to realize they were the ones locked inside the cage? A calculated sacrifice of flesh is a profoundly small price to pay for a comprehensive map of an enemy's nervous system. Silas Vance was more than willing to buy that map with his own skin. The standoff in the sweltering plasma foundry held for a long, suffocating minute. The head warden, his four eyes narrowing in frustration at the complete lack of human panic, gestured sharply to a subordinate. The younger guard hurried forward, dragging a heavy metallic crate across the steel deck. He kicked the latch open, revealing rows of thick obsidian half-circles lined with crystalline circuitry. They were shock collars, designed for beasts of burden. A small, levitating orb detached itself from the head warden's armored belt, floating upward to hover between the two opposing groups. It emitted a soft blue scanning laser that swept over the 50 human convicts. Then, it spoke. The voice was a flat, synthesized approximation of English, devoid of inflection but heavy with mechanical authority. You are property of the Valyrian Empire. The floating orb droned, translating the warden's sharp, grinding native syllables. You will affix the obedience bands to your throats. Disobedience will be met with the fire. Compliance will be met with sustenance. Begin. Vance did not take his eyes off the head warden. He stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the hot grating, and reached into the crate. He pulled out one of the heavy obsidian bands. He turned it over in his hands, examining the locking mechanism and the conductive nodes meant to rest against the carotid artery. It was a crude, brutal piece of technology, entirely reliant on pain compliance. He looked at Elena Rostova. She stood perfectly still, her pale eyes tracking the subtle weight shifts of the surrounding guards. Vance gave her the signal, a fractional tilt of his chin. He dropped the collar. It clattered loudly against the deck. With a swift, casual motion, he kicked it away. It slid across the floor and struck the toe of the head warden's armored boot. The alien overseer roared a command, a vicious sound that the floating orb immediately translated as a singular automated word, punishment. Vance lunged. He did not aim to kill. A dead guard provided zero actionable intelligence. He aimed to provoke a maximum systemic response. He closed the distance instantly, his shoulder dropping low to bypass the warden's high center of gravity. He grabbed the long haft of the crackling plasma pike, twisting it violently to test the alien's physical strength and grip mechanics. The warden was strong, but his reaction time was sluggish, hindered by the rigid crystalline armor plating at his elbows. Chaos erupted, orchestrated and precisely contained. Rostova moved like a shadow, slipping past a guard's flank and delivering a crushing palm strike to the unarmored joint behind his knee. The alien buckled. Beside her, a massive convict who had formerly run the entire orbital narcotic trade over Mars shoved two guards backward, absorbing their frantic, uncoordinated blows with terrifying stoicism. Vance kept his focus entirely on the data collection. He held the pike, wrestling the warden for control, waiting for the inevitable escalation. It took exactly 4 seconds. The warden, panicking under the physical pressure of the human convict, wrenched a secondary sidearm from his hip. He fired blindly. A blinding flash of superheated blue plasma struck Vance squarely in the left shoulder. The kinetic force threw Vance backward, the agonizing heat immediately cauterizing the wound as it burned through muscle and skin. He hit the deck hard, rolling to distribute the impact. Through the blinding pain, his mind recorded the vital statistics of the encounter. The sidearm required a 3-second cycle rate between discharges. The primary plasma pikes were unwieldy in close-quarters combat. The guards possessed terrible peripheral vision, relying heavily on head movement to track lateral threats. More importantly, the ship's automated security protocols engaged. Blinding crimson warning strobes flared to life along the ceiling bulkheads. Heavy, interlocking blast doors slammed down at the corridor exits, sealing off the foundry sector. Vance counted the seconds. 8 seconds from the initiation of combat to total sector lockdown. The internal bulkheads were physically reinforced, not just magnetically shielded. "Stand down," Vance commanded, his voice tight with pain but projecting clearly over the shouting guards. The micro-riot ceased instantly. Rostova stepped back, raising her hands in a gesture of mock surrender. The massive Martian cartel boss dropped to his knees, lacing his fingers behind his head. The remaining convicts mirrored the action, transforming from a highly coordinated strike force back into a submissive, defeated herd in the blink of an eye. The Valerian guards were breathing heavily, their alien features twisted in a mixture of fury and genuine terror. They leveled their weapons at the kneeling humans, their fingers twitching on the triggers. The head warden marched forward, his face flushed a dark violet. He stood over Vance, pointing the sidearm directly at the human's forehead. Vance stared up at the alien weapon, his expression completely blank. He had his map. The Empire was arrogant, over-reliant on heavy firepower, and severely lacking in close-quarters discipline. The warden shouted a harsh command, lowering the weapon slightly. He needed the laborers alive. Dead flesh could not stoke the plasma furnaces. The guards moved in cautiously, forcing the obsidian collars onto the necks of the kneeling convicts. When they snapped a band around Vance's throat, the device emitted a sharp, agonizing electrical pulse, forcing his muscles to seize. He absorbed the shock, gritting his teeth, offering the aliens the illusion of total control. Satisfied that the rebellion had been crushed, the wardens herded the convicts into a massive, heavily shielded holding pen adjacent to the main foundry floor. The heavy energy barriers hummed to life, sealing the humans inside a stark, metallic cage devoid of any furnishings. Vance leaned heavily against the cold steel bulkhead, sliding down to sit on the floor. His left shoulder was a blackened, agonizing ruin. The pain was beginning to break through the adrenaline, a deep, throbbing ache that threatened to compromise his focus. A shadow fell over him. Doctor, Eris Thorne crouched down beside him, her movements precise and entirely devoid of bedside manner. Thorne was a legend in the Earth's subterranean black markets, a brilliant geneticist and cybernetics engineer who had treated the human body as an open-source hardware project. She had been sentenced to Tartarus for outfitting unregulated mercenary companies with military-grade neural accelerants. Thin, silver threads of illegal neural wiring traced delicate patterns across her temples, catching the dim light of the holding cell. For a renowned tactical genius, you have an incredibly stupid way of asking for directions, Thorne said, her voice a dry, cynical drawl. I prefer hands-on learning. Doctor, Vance replied, managing a tight, humorless smile. Thorne reached into the standard-issue gray jumpsuit she wore, producing a sleek, silver cylinder. During the brief, violent scuffle in the foundry, she had cleanly pickpocketed a medical kit from the belt of a fallen guard. She pressed a hidden latch, and the cylinder expanded into a glowing diagnostic tool filled with bioluminescent alien gels. You are lucky their biology relies on similar protein structures, she muttered, analyzing the deep plasma burn on his shoulder. Otherwise, I would be patching you up with engine grease and blind optimism. She extracted a small measure of a glowing blue gel onto her fingertips. With surprising gentleness, she applied it directly to the charred flesh of Vance's shoulder. The effect was instantaneous. The searing agony vanished, replaced by a profound, icy numbness that sank deep into the muscle tissue. Vance let out a long, slow breath, his tense frame finally relaxing against the bulkhead. He looked at Thorne, genuinely impressed. They use a rapid cellular regeneration compound, Thorne explained, wiping the remaining gel from her hands. It forces the tissue to replicate at an accelerated rate to seal the breach. It is elegant, if somewhat heavy-handed. She lingered for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against his collarbone as she checked his pulse rate. The proximity was unexpected. In the cold, sterile environment of the Tartarus, survival had been the only metric of existence. Here, in the belly of an alien warship, a strange, quiet intimacy flickered between them. They were two brilliant, dangerous minds trapped in a cage, finding a singular point of grounding in each other. Vance met her gaze, seeing the sharp, calculating intellect behind her cynical exterior. What else did you learn while you were playing the victim? She asked softly, leaning in close so the surrounding convicts could not hear. Their weapons are high yield but slow to cycle, Vance whispered. Their armor restricts lateral mobility, and their sector lockdown is completely automated, which means it can be bypassed if we find the central routing nodes. Thorne smiled, a genuine, dangerous expression. I noticed something else. During the fight, the warden never used a comlink to call for the lockdown. He pressed 2 fingers against a crystalline node embedded directly into his temple. Their internal communication network is not radio-based. It is a localized biological neural net. Vance absorbed the information, his mind instantly racing through the strategic implications. If the aliens communicated telepathically through a localized network, they could coordinate perfectly without making a sound. But a network was just a series of connections, and any connection could be severed, jammed, or hijacked. Can you shield us from it? Vance asked. Give me enough scrap copper and an hour near their power conduits, and I can make us completely invisible to their minds. Thorne replied, her silver neural threads catching the light as she tilted her head. Vance nodded slowly, the pain in his shoulder entirely forgotten. The holding cell was quiet, the 50 convicts resting and waiting for their leader's next move. Beneath the heavy steel floorboards, a strange, rhythmic vibration pulsed rhythmically, a deep, resonant hum that suggested they were sitting directly above a massive, unshielded energy source. The cages were locked, the collars were armed, and the alien empire believed they had secured a victory. They were entirely wrong. Pride is a blinding light, capable of obscuring the sharpest blade resting right against a man's throat. Commander Vael was currently staring directly into the sun, in the opulent, vaulted chambers of his private quarters. Vael stood before a massive holographic projection array. The air was perfumed with rare, synthetic orchids, a stark contrast to the ozone and sweat filling the lower decks. Floating before him were the translucent, violet-tinted visages of 3 high lords of the Imperial Senate. They were draped in the heavy, jeweled silks of the inner worlds, looking down their noses at Vael's border patrol armor. "Tens of thousands, Vael," Lord Krytos sneered, his 4 eyes narrowing in aristocratic skepticism. "Yet you claim to have captured an entire generation of laborers without firing a single ship-to-ship volley. The Senate finds this highly irregular. The Senate underestimates the sheer, pathetic vulnerability of the human species," Vael countered smoothly, swirling his luminescent wine. "They package themselves in a slow-moving, unshielded cargo vessel. My wardens are already putting the first block to work in the lower foundries. They are remarkably sturdy beasts, perfect for the plasma furnaces." Lord Silas, an ancient and influential rival, leaned forward in his projection. "If this bounty is as vast as you claim, the Emperor will undoubtedly elevate your house. However, claims are merely vapor until verified. The Inquisition has dispatched an auditor. He will rendezvous with the Ethel Guard in precisely 3 solar cycles to count your so-called prize. Ensure they are presentable. Vael." The transmission severed, leaving the room in a quiet, amber glow. Vael smiled, taking a slow sip of his wine. An auditor was a minor inconvenience, a mere formality before his inevitable ascension. He envisioned his triumphant return to the capital world, completely oblivious to the fact that his sturdy beasts were currently reverse-engineering his warship from the inside out, deep within the suffocating heat of the holding pens. The true rulers of the Ethel Guard were convening their first council. The 50 inmates of Cell Block Alpha were a volatile cocktail of humanity's worst nightmares. There were former warlords who had drowned entire Earth continents in fire, sociopathic cartel bosses from the Martian colonies, and disgraced military leaders. Left to their own devices, they would have slaughtered each other within the hour. Silas Vance did not leave them to their own devices. He stood in the center of the dimly lit energy cage, the raw burn on his shoulder packed tightly with alien medical gel. Elena Rostova flanked him to his right, a silent executioner coiled with lethal potential. Doctor. Eris Thorne stood to his left, her eyes darting over the complex circuitry of a smuggled piece of Valerian tech. A heavily scarred man named Jax, who once ruled the underground weapon syndicates of Neo-Tokyo, crossed his massive arms. "You talk a good game, Vance, but we are wearing explosive collars inside an alien energy cage. You want us to play nice and shovel plasma for these 4-eyed freaks?" "I want you to survive long enough to steal their ship," Vance replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Right now, we are 50 isolated targets. If we fight each other, we do the Empire's job for them. From this moment forward, your past allegiances are dead. There are no cartels here. There are no syndicates. There is only this crew. And there is the enemy outside that barrier." Jax scoffed, stepping forward to challenge the hierarchy. "And who made you the Admiral?" Rostova moved. It was not a violent blur, but a perfectly calibrated shifting of weight. She stepped directly into Jax's personal space, gazing up into his heavily augmented face. Her expression was utterly serene, I did, Rostova said, her voice barely a whisper. And if you dispute the chain of command, I will systematically dislocate every major joint in your body, fold you into a neat geometric square, and use you as a footstool. The cartel boss looked down at the pale, terrifyingly calm woman. He had survived assassination attempts, orbital bombardments, and maximum security shivvies. But the absolute void in Rostova's eyes sent a primal shiver down his spine. He took a slow, deliberate step back and offered a stiff nod. The chain of command was instantly solidified. With the hierarchy established, Vance turned his attention to the immediate tactical problem. The Valyrian guards operated with uncanny synchronization, a hive-mind efficiency that made traditional ambushes impossible. He looked at Thorn, who was currently dismantling the internal locking mechanism of a stolen plasma torch she had concealed in her jumpsuit during the Foundry scuffle. "Doctor, talk to me about the localized neural net," Vance said, pacing the length of the holding pen. "It is an elegant but highly vulnerable system," Thorn explained, holding up a microscopic shard of crystalline circuitry. "They use a biological interface to broadcast their thoughts via shortwave telepathy. It makes them fast, but it also makes them incredibly susceptible to external noise. Right now, they can sense our surface emotions. They can taste our anger, our fear. It is how they monitor the herd." "Can you build a blindfold?" Vance asked. Thorn smiled, her silver neural threads glinting. "I can do better than a blindfold. I can build a wall, but I need materials. During the next work cycle in the foundries, I need your people to harvest copper wiring from the secondary plasma conduits. I need raw scrap iron, conductive adhesives, and access to a high-heat fusion cutter." Vance nodded, turning back to the assembled convicts. The mission parameters were set. They were no longer prisoners waiting for a beating. They were an embedded covert operations team executing a supply run. Over the next 2 brutal work cycles, the inmates of Cell Block Alpha played their parts to perfection. Under the searing heat of the alien furnaces and the crackling threat of the plasma pikes, they hauled heavy fuel rods and maintained the massive turbine engines. But beneath the guise of submissive labor, a highly orchestrated theft ring was in motion. Jax and his heavy muscle created calculated distractions, dropping massive crates of slag to draw the guards' attention. In those brief windows of chaos, Rostova and her swift-handed associates stripped copper wire from exposed junction boxes, palming the precious metal and slipping it into their boots. Vance mapped the guard patrols, timing the sweeping scans of the automated security cameras down to the millisecond. By the time the energy barriers of the holding pen hummed shut at the end of the second cycle, Thorn had a mountain of illicit materials piled in the corner of their cage. She worked with obsessive, terrifying speed. Using the stolen fusion cutter, she melted down the scrap iron, weaving the salvaged copper wire into intricate, delicate mesh patterns. The romantic tension between her and Vance simmered quietly in the background as he knelt beside her, holding the makeshift tools and anticipating her needs before she even asked. "You have steady hands for a tactician," Thorn noted, expertly soldering a microscopic copper thread to the casing of a shock collar. "I have spent my entire life building intricate machines designed to ruin other people's days," Vance replied quietly, handing her another strip of iron. "This is just a shift in the medium." Thorn finished the first prototype. It was a crude, ugly piece of hardware, a small dome-shaped metallic cap designed to snap directly over the locking mechanism of the Valyrian shock collars. She attached it to the band currently secured around Vance's neck. "A moment of truth," Thorn whispered. She activated the tiny device. A low, barely audible mechanical hum vibrated against Vance's throat. The makeshift Faraday cage generated a localized electromagnetic scrambling field. entirely disrupting the biological frequencies used by the Valyrian guards. Thorn closed her eyes, tapping into her own illegal neural implants to scan the ambient frequencies of the ship. She opened them a moment later, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. "You are a ghost," Thorn announced. To the guards outside, "Your mind just dropped off the radar entirely. You are registering as inert biological matter." A dangerous murmur of approval swept through the holding pen. The balance of power was tipping, but Thorn held up a hand, her eyes locked on the modified collar. She had discovered a structural flaw in the Valyrian design, an architectural oversight that could change the entire nature of their rebellion. She realized the signal from the shock collars was not just a one-way tracking beacon. It was a two-way conduit directly into the Ethelgard's central security mainframe. If she could block their minds from being read, she might also be able to inject her own data right back into the alien empire's skull. The cage door was not just unlocked. The keys to the entire dreadnought were sitting right in front of them. A flawless machine only requires a single grain of sand in its gears to tear itself apart. The Valyrian Empire, for all its golden splendor and aristocratic arrogance, was about to discover exactly how abrasive human nature could be. Equipped with the crude but highly effective neural dampeners Dr. Eris Thorn had fashioned from stolen copper and scrap iron, the 50 inmates of Cell Block Alpha became digital ghosts. To the localized telepathic network of the alien guards, the humans registered as nothing more than inert biological matter, devoid of any surface thoughts or hostile intent. This invisibility allowed them to launch a campaign of systematic, invisible warfare right under the noses of their captors. They exploited the one massive vulnerability in the Valyrian military caste, their rigid, honor-bound adherence to protocol. The alien guards were soldiers of ancient tradition, operating on strict schedules and predetermined patrol routes. They were entirely incapable of anticipating chaotic, asymmetrical improvisation. During their grueling shifts in the searing heat of the plasma foundries, Elena Rostova and her crew went to work. They did not plant explosives or stage grand acts of defiance. Instead, they engaged in a masterclass of subtle mechanical sabotage. Rostova moved silently through the heavy industrial machinery, utilizing her Black Ops training to bypass the crude internal security sensors. She systematically misaligned the thermal regulators on the secondary cooling conduits. Across the vast foundry floor, Jax and his heavy muscle enforcers used their brute strength to over-torque pressure valves and shear off the locking pins on the primary ventilation shafts. To the arrogant Valyrian overseers, the resulting localized failures looked like standard mechanical decay or the clumsy mistakes of inferior, soft-skinned beasts. They ordered the humans to work harder, entirely blind to the fact that every loosened bolt, every jammed sensor, and every blocked exhaust vent was a carefully calculated mathematical equation. Vance was steadily pushing the dreadnought's lower decks toward a catastrophic cascade failure. But destroying the ship's internal infrastructure was only half the battle. They needed the keys to drive the vessel once they took control. Silas Vance found his target during the fourth restorative cycle, when the foundry was quiet and the primary lighting was dimmed to a deep, oceanic blue. His name, according to the encrypted duty roster Thorn had managed to slice out of the maintenance drone network, was Kalen. Unlike the brutal head warden or the haughty officers of the upper decks, Kalen lacked the aggressive, rigid posture of a true imperial believer. He was a low-ranking conscript from a subjugated border world, relegated to perimeter duty outside the human holding pens while the high-caste elites engaged in their luxurious communal sleep cycles. Kalen watched the humans not with the customary disgust of his peers, but with a quiet, lingering curiosity. He had noticed that these creatures did not break under the lash, and their eyes held a terrifying, calculating intelligence. Vance approached the shimmering energy barrier of the holding pen, He did not posture, nor did he make any sudden, threatening movements. He simply sat cross-legged on the cold steel grating, resting his arms on his knees, and spoke directly to the alien guard standing on the other side of the force field. "You stand on that side of the glass, and I sit on this side," Vance said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, translated perfectly by the small, automated orb hovering near the cell. "Tell me, Kalen, which one of us is actually in the cage?" Kalen flinched, his four eyes widening in profound shock. It was not just that the beast knew his name, it was the articulate, piercing nature of the question. He gripped his crackling plasma pike tighter, grounding himself in his military training. "You are the prisoner, human," Kalen replied, his voice a harsh, grinding sound translated into flat English by the orb. "You are the property of the Emperor. I am a sworn sentinel of the Eternal Fleet. I enforce the order of the galaxy." "You are a slave to a uniform," Vance countered smoothly, his tone conversational and completely devoid of malice. "I watched your commanding officer strike you yesterday for a minor inflection error during a status report. I see how the high caste officers look right through you, as if you are a piece of the bulkheads. They sent you down to the darkest, most highly irradiated corner of this ship to watch over dirt farmers. You are not a sentinel. Kalen, you are a disposable piece of equipment they deploy and forget." The words struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow because they echoed the dark, treacherous thoughts he had harbored in secret for years. Over the next 3 cycles, whenever Kalen was assigned to the solitary perimeter watch, Vance relentlessly chipped away at the young alien's lifelong indoctrination. Through the hum of the energy barrier, they engaged in a dangerous, quiet dialogue about the true nature of freedom and servitude. Kalen argued passionately that the Empire brought necessary structure to a chaotic, savage universe, and that absolute servitude to the Emperor was the highest form of purpose any living creature could achieve. A purpose assigned by someone else is just obedience, Vance told him during a particularly tense exchange. True freedom is the terrifying responsibility of choosing your own path, even if that path leads to suffering. The people in this cell, we are monsters, Kalen. We are criminals and killers. But we chose our paths. We own our darkness. You were born into a caste system that determined your worth, your rank, and your ultimate death before you took your very first breath. If you burn alive in these foundries tomorrow, your Emperor will not mourn you. He will simply requisition another armored suit to stand exactly where you are standing. The absolute breaking point arrived unexpectedly during the next work cycle. The foundry's ambient temperature spiked violently, a direct result of Jax's ongoing sabotage of the coolant lines. The localized telepathic neural net flared with panicked, overlapping orders. The high caste officers remained safely on the climate-controlled upper decks, coldly commanding Kalen and his low-ranking peers to plunge into the hazardous, unshielded radiation zones to manually vent the overheating core. Kalen obeyed. He watched in horror as 2 of his squadmates suffered severe, agonizing plasma burns, their crystalline armor melting into their flesh while the officers observed safely through their holographic feeds, offering neither aid nor empathy. When Kalen returned to his post outside the human holding pen hours later, his armor was scorched black and his hands were trembling. He stood before the energy barrier and looked at Silas Vance. The arrogant, unwavering light of the Valyrian Empire had completely died in the young guard's eyes. "What do you need?" Kalen whispered. Vance did not hesitate. He had been waiting for this exact moment. "I need the ship's schematics. I need the internal sensor routing network. And I need the primary access codes to the heavy armory on this deck." Kalen stepped closer to the energy barrier. He looked over his shoulder, ensuring the corridor was empty. before executing a rapid, complex series of keystrokes on his wrist-mounted console. He briefly dropped the localized magnetic shielding of the cell by a fraction of a millimeter. It was just enough space, for just enough time, to slip a small, glowing Valerian data crystal through the microscopic gap. Vance caught it seamlessly, his fist closing tightly around the ultimate prize. If they find out what I have done, they will execute my entire bloodline on my homeworld, Kalen said, his voice heavy with the gravity of his treason. When we are finished with this ship, Vance replied coldly, there won't be anyone left to sign the execution order. They now possessed the complete, unredacted blueprint of the Ethelguard. They knew the locations of the blind spots, the exact timing of the elite guard patrol routes, and the precise thickness of the heavy blast doors separating them from the primary command bridge. Thorne immediately went to work decoding the glowing crystal, her eyes scanning the scrolling alien data with predatory hunger. But a new, highly volatile variable had just entered the equation. The sudden, unauthorized microfluctuation in the holding pen's energy barrier had triggered a silent, automated anomaly report deep within the Ethelguard's central security mainframe. The question was no longer whether the Valerian elites would notice the anomaly, but whether Rostova's lethal strike team could plunge the dreadnought into absolute darkness before the alien inquisitors came looking for the traitor in their ranks. Darkness in the void of space is a natural constant, but the sudden, suffocating darkness inside the belly of a dying warship is an invitation to slaughter. It was finally time to turn off the lights. Armed with the unredacted schematics Kalen had provided and the localized neural dampeners constructed from scrap, Dr. Eris Thorne executed the final phase of their mechanical sabotage. Sitting cross-legged in the center of the holding pen, she wired the stolen Valerian data crystal directly into the dismantled casing of a service drone they had snagged during a shift change. Her fingers flew across the makeshift interface, isolating the primary power routing nodes for the entire lower quadrant of the Ethelguard. She did not just shut the systems down. She fed the central mainframe a looping, fabricated diagnostic code that masked the catastrophic failure as a simple thermal sensor glitch. Deep within the foundry walls, the stressed coolant lines Jax and his enforcers had been quietly over-torquing for days finally gave way. The resulting cascade failure was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. The primary plasma turbines choked, starved of their cooling agent. To prevent a massive core meltdown, the dreadnought's automated safety protocols violently severed power to the entire industrial sector. The blinding, searing light of the foundries vanished instantly. The oppressive hum of the massive machinery ground to a halt. The emergency crimson strobes flickered to life for a fraction of a second before Thorne's virus smothered them out. The lower decks plunged into absolute, impenetrable blackness. Most importantly, the heavy energy barriers of the human holding pens died with a quiet, pathetic fizzle. Silas Vance stepped out of the cage, the heavy, airless silence of the dead sector wrapping around him. He gave a single sharp hand signal in the dark. The 50 inmates of Cell Block Alpha fanned out into the black corridors, moving with the synchronized, lethal intent of a wolf pack slipping off its chains. High above, in the pristine command center of the dreadnought, Commander Vael swiped an annoyed hand through a holographic status projection. The entire lower hemisphere of his ship was reading as inactive. He assumed the primitive, clumsy beasts he had enslaved had managed to foul the intricate cooling mechanisms through sheer, ignorant incompetence. Unwilling to risk his elite sentinels on what amounted to a glorified plumbing issue, Vael dispatched 3 heavily armed engineering squads to the lower decks to restore the flow of plasma and punish the offenders. They descended into the dark, completely unprepared for the ghosts waiting for them. The Valerian engineering teams moved down the wide, pitch-black corridors, their path illuminated only by the harsh, narrow beams of their shoulder-mounted floodlights. They were technicians augmented with heavy military plating, relying entirely on their localized telepathic neural net to maintain formation. They expected to find huddled, shivering humans choking on vented steam. They expected easy targets. Elena Rostova found them first. She did not use a weapon. She used the architecture of the ship itself, clinging to the heavy ceiling support struts, completely invisible to their thermal scanners thanks to the ambient heat of the venting steam. Rostova dropped silently into the center of the first five-man squad. She moved with a fluid, terrifying efficiency that defied human biology. Before the aliens could even process the sudden disruption in their formation, she shattered the knee joint of the rear guard, using his collapsing weight to pull him entirely out of the light. The alien neural net flared with a sudden, sharp spike of confusion, followed instantly by a terrifying, absolute silence from the missing squad member. The squad leader spun around, his floodlights sweeping through the swirling steam, illuminating nothing but empty bulkheads and exposed wiring. He opened his mouth to shout a command, but a heavy steel pry bar, wielded by a massive Martian cartel enforcer leaping from a side alcove, crushed his crystalline helmet inward. The squad dissolved into absolute panic. They fired their plasma pikes blindly into the shadows, the superheated blue bolts illuminating the dark for brief, violent flashes. In those flashes, they saw their executioners. The hardened criminals of Tartarus descended on the engineering teams with a tidal wave of suppressed rage and brutal kinetic violence. They used sharpened shivs fashioned from fuel rods, heavy chains ripped from the automated lifters, and their bare hands. They dragged the aliens into the dark alcoves, exploiting the blind spots in their armor and the slow cycle rates of their weapons. It was a massacre orchestrated in the shadows, a localized extermination that the upper decks remained completely blind to. As the last Valyrian technician fell, the humans claimed their first real spoils of war: military-grade plasma weaponry. Jax picked up an elegant, sweeping Valyrian rifle. It was a masterpiece of alien engineering, crafted from polished obsidian and glowing crystalline energy nodes. It was also entirely useless in his massive, heavily scarred hands. The grip was designed for the slender four-fingered hands of the aristocratic caste, and the trigger guard was far too small. "I cannot even fit my finger in this delicate little toy," Jax growled, tossing the weapon against a steel crate in frustration. Vance stepped into the dim light of a discarded shoulder lamp. "Then make it fit. Jax, we are not entering a beauty contest. We are taking a warship." What followed was a profound desecration of advanced alien technology. The criminals of Cell Block Alpha did not respect the elegant engineering of their captors. They simply needed the weapons to kill efficiently. They dragged the captured arsenal back to the staging area and went to work with crude, brutal ingenuity. Jax used his massive combat knife to violently pry the restrictive trigger guards off the plasma rifles. When the polished obsidian grips proved too slippery for hands slick with sweat and cooling fluid, the humans ripped long, thick strips of fabric from their heavy gray prison jumpsuits. They wrapped the grips tightly, securing the fabric with thick, resin-based industrial sealant they had scraped from the heavy pipe joints. "Doctor." Thorne watched in a state of amused horror as the cartel boss essentially duct-taped a state-of-the-art energy weapon. She stepped in only to bypass the weapon's biometric safety limiters. With a few precise cuts and a crude splice of copper wire, she short-circuited the thermal regulators. The result was a terrifying, bastardized hybrid weapon. The elegant Valyrian rifles were transformed into bulky, ugly hand cannons wrapped in dirty fabric and smeared with industrial grease. Because Thorne had bypassed the thermal limiters, the weapons now fired at double the standard cycle rate, emitting a dangerous, aggressive hum that threatened to overheat the casing entirely. They were unstable, brutally ugly, and absolutely devastating in close-quarters combat. Armed with their new arsenal, The convicts moved swiftly to the secondary objective, using the access codes Kalen had provided. Vance bypassed the heavy biometric locks on the lower deck armory. The heavy blast doors slid open, revealing racks of heavy ordnance, concussive grenades, and breaching charges. The humans loaded up, shedding the last remnants of their status as prisoners and fully adopting their role as an elite assault force. Vance checked the charge on his modified rifle, the crude fabric grip feeling perfectly anchored in his hand. He looked at his crew. They were bruised, covered in grease and alien blood, and heavily armed with highly unstable energy weapons. They looked like absolute monsters. Vance had never been more proud of a tactical unit in his life. They had successfully secured the entire lower hemisphere of the Ethel Guard without triggering a single ship-wide alarm. But the element of stealth was rapidly evaporating. The prolonged silence from the 3 dispatched engineering squads was finally beginning to raise genuine alarms on the command bridge. Furthermore, the automated structural diagnostics were rebooting, slowly fighting through Thorne's fabricated virus. It was only a matter of minutes before Commander Vael realized he was not dealing with a mechanical failure, but a highly coordinated hostile takeover. And out in the dark of space, entirely unknown to Vance and his crew, the sleek, heavily armed vessel of the Imperial Inquisitor had just dropped out of hyperspace, accelerating on an intercept course to audit Commander Vael's legendary new prize. The timeline had just violently compressed, and the true battle for the Ethel Guard was about to begin. A revolution cannot survive indefinitely in the dark. Sooner or later, the fire has to spread upward and consume the throne. Silas Vance understood that the element of surprise was a rapidly depreciating asset, and the time for quiet sabotage had officially expired. The 50 inmates of Cell Block Alpha ascended through the pitch-black vertical maintenance shafts of the Ethel Guard, climbing like heavily armed spiders toward the secondary command hub on Deck 4. This sector was the neurological center of the Dreadnought's internal defenses, controlling the automated turrets, the localized gravity plating, and the heavy bulkhead doors. Taking it would effectively paralyze the Valerian crew, blinding the upper echelons while giving the humans absolute control over the battlefield. Dr. Eris Thorne led the vertical ascent, her silver neural threads glowing faintly in the gloom. She reached the heavy maintenance hatch directly beneath the secondary command floor and interfaced her stolen data crystal with the lock. She did not attempt to gently bypass the security measures. She forcefully overrode the magnetic seals, sending a massive feedback loop directly into the locking mechanism. "Breaching," Thorne announced, dropping gracefully down the shaft to make room for the heavy hitters. The thick metal hatch detonated upward, blown violently off its hinges by a perfectly shaped kinetic charge. The assault that followed was a masterpiece of lethal, synchronized violence. Vance and Elena Rostova erupted from the shaft, immediately fanning out to opposite sides of the room. The Valerian sentinels guarding the hub were elite soldiers, fully armored and heavily armed, but they were entirely unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the human vanguard. They expected a chaotic mob of desperate, starving laborers stumbling blindly into their kill zone. Instead, they faced a highly coordinated military strike force. Vance and his crew moved with terrifying tactical precision. They executed flawless bounding Overwatch maneuvers, using the glowing holographic projection tables as cover. The bastardized, tape-wrapped plasma rifles the humans carried roared with an aggressive, unstable hum, spitting superheated blue fire at double the standard cycle rate. The elegant crystalline armor of the Valerian sentinels, designed to gracefully deflect glancing energy blasts, simply shattered under the sustained brute force barrage. High above the slaughter, in the pristine environment of the primary command bridge, Commander Vael was rapidly losing his composure. The silence from the lower decks had stretched far beyond a simple communication blackout. He paced furiously around his command throne, demanding answers from his terrified sensor officers. A high caste technician, sweating profusely beneath his ceremonial armor, finally managed to slice through the localized jamming field Thorn had established. He bypassed the corrupted main feeds and tapped directly into a raw, unfiltered optical sensor located in the secondary command hub. E-visual established. Commander. The technician gasped, routing the feed to the central holographic projector. The image flickered to life in the center of the bridge, bathing Vael in a harsh, pale light. He stopped pacing. The luminescent chalice of wine slipped from his elegant fingers, shattering against the polished obsidian floor. He watched in absolute paralyzing horror as his ship was systematically dismantled. These were not agricultural workers. They were not docile farmers broken by gravity and toil. Vael watched a heavily scarred, heavily muscled human casually flank two of his elite sentinels, slide beneath their overlapping fields of fire, and neutralize them with chilling mechanical efficiency. He saw squads of humans communicating through complex, silent hand signals, laying down suppressive fire while their counterparts bounded forward to secure choke points. Vael's political aspirations, his grand visions of standing before the Emperor as a conquering hero, crumbled into fine dust. The Earth Registry had been a lie, a clever camouflage designed to keep the civilized galaxy far away. He had not captured a petting zoo. He had willingly swallowed a cage of apex predators. His life, along with the lives of everyone on the upper decks, was now in immediate, catastrophic peril. Down in the secondary command hub, the chaotic roar of plasma fire abruptly ceased. The air was thick with the acrid stench of ozone, burning synthetic fabric, and vaporized metal. The sentinels were dead, their shattered crystalline armor scattered across the floor. The humans had secured the room, taking complete control of the dreadnought's internal grid. But as the smoke began to clear, a new, deeply volatile variable emerged from the shadows. Huddled together in the sunken primary server pit at the center of the room were 12 Valyrian technicians. They wore the thin, unarmored silk uniforms of the data analysis caste. They held no weapons. They were non-combatants, entirely reliant on the sentinels for protection. Now, they were surrounded by massive, blood-soaked human convicts, their 4 eyes wide with unadulterated terror as they awaited execution. Jax, the former Martian cartel boss, racked the cooling slide of his modified rifle. The weapon hissed, venting excess heat as he stepped toward the edge of the server pit. His face, a twisted map of old scars and fresh plasma burns, was completely devoid of empathy. "Line them up," Jax grunted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "They collared us like animals. They tossed us in the furnaces. Let them burn." A low murmur of agreement rippled through a few of the other convicts. They were killers by trade, men and women who had survived the absolute worst of humanity by entirely discarding their moral compasses. The aliens had enslaved them, humiliated them, and tortured them. Revenge was not just appealing, it felt entirely justified. Silas Vance stepped forward, placing himself directly between the barrel of Jax's rifle and the cowering Valyrian technicians. He did not raise his own weapon. He simply stood his ground, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto the cartel boss. "Put the rifle down, Jax," Vance ordered, his voice echoing loudly in the silent, smoke-filled room. Jax scowled, his massive shoulders tensing. "You are getting soft, tactician. Earth tossed us in a black hole because they said we were rabid dogs. These 4-eyed freaks looked at us and saw nothing but cheap meat. Why do they get to breathe? Because if we slaughter unarmed non-combatants, we prove every single one of those corrupt Earth politicians, right?" Vance replied, his tone razor-sharp and unyielding. "Earth threw us away to justify their own systemic failures. They needed monsters to keep their citizens afraid and compliant. But we are taking a sovereign warship today. Jax. We are no longer prisoners. We are an army. And an army has a code. We kill the soldiers who stand in our way. We do not butcher the clerks. Elena Rostova materialized silently at Jax's right side. She did not speak, but she slightly lowered the barrel of her weapon, shifting her weight into a perfectly balanced combat stance. The silent threat was overwhelmingly clear. If Jax pulled his trigger, he would be dead before the plasma bolt ever reached the technicians. The heavy tension in the room hung by a microscopic thread. Jax looked at Vance, then glanced sideways at the pale, terrifying void in Rostova's eyes. He let out a harsh breath, lowered his rifle, and spat a glob of blood onto the pristine deck. "Fine," Jax muttered, stepping back into the perimeter. "But when they inevitably try to stab us in the back, I get to say I told you so." Vance nodded, acknowledging the concession. He ordered his crew to securely bind the terrified technicians with heavy industrial zip ties and lock them safely inside a reinforced server closet with adequate life support. It was a profound, defining moment for the 50 convicts of Cell Block Alpha. They had collectively chosen to draw a line in the sand, separating the necessary brutality of their survival from the senseless cruelty of their former captors. They were building a new identity in the stars, forged not just in violence, but in disciplined restraint. With the moral crisis averted, Vance turned his attention to the central holographic tactical table. Thorn was already rapidly slicing through the network firewalls, establishing a direct link to the Dreadnought's primary sensors. "The internal defense grid is ours," Thorn reported, her fingers flying over the alien interface. "I have locked down all the grav lifts leading to the bridge. Vael is completely trapped up there." "Show me the bridge defenses," Vance commanded. The hologram shifted, displaying a highly detailed schematic of the primary command center. Vance grimaced. Commander Vael had not remained idle during his panic. He had initiated the supreme lockdown protocols. The bridge was now sealed behind a multi-layered, reinforced energy shield that drew power directly from the ship's main drive core. The bastardized plasma rifles would barely scratch it, and they did not have the heavy artillery required to crack a shielded military vault. But Thorn was not looking at the bridge schematics. She was staring intently at a flashing crimson rune on the edge of the long-range sensor display. "Silas," Thorn said, her cynical drawl replaced by a tone of genuine alarm. "We have a much larger problem than a locked door." Vance looked at the display. A massive, heavily armed Imperial vessel had just dropped out of hyperspace on the extreme edge of the sector. It was accelerating at a terrifying speed, burning hard on a direct intercept course with the Ethel Guard. It broadcasted a singular, highly encrypted military signature that Kalen's stolen data crystal immediately translated. The Inquisition had arrived early to audit Commander Vael's legendary new prize. The timeline for their rebellion had just violently compressed. If they did not breach the bridge and take full control of the Dreadnought's navigation systems before the Inquisitor arrived, they would be utterly obliterated by the sheer firepower of the incoming Imperial warship. A ticking clock is the only force in the universe capable of turning an impenetrable fortress into a desperate suicide mission, with a heavily armed Imperial Inquisitor burning hard toward their coordinates. Silas Vance had exactly 4 minutes to crack the unbreakable energy shield of the Ethel Guard's command bridge before they were all reduced to radioactive ash. Vance stood in the wide, polished corridor leading to the primary command center, staring down the massive, shimmering wall of blue kinetic energy blocking their path. Behind that shield lay the navigation controls, the heavy weapons arrays, and the architect of their enslavement, Commander Vael. Behind Vance stood his 50 hardened convicts, their makeshift weapons humming with unstable heat, their eyes locked on the prize. They had fought their way up through the dark, suffocating bowels of the dreadnought, and they were absolutely not going to die waiting outside a locked door. Doctor. Eris Thorne tapped furiously at the holographic interface of her stolen data pad, her silver neural implants pulsing rapidly. She ran a dozen complex algorithms against the shield's frequency, searching for a digital backdoor. After 10 agonizing seconds, she shook her head, her face pale in the blue light of the barrier. The shield drew its power directly from the dreadnought's main drive core. It was a closed loop, entirely isolated from the secondary networks they had already compromised. They could not hack it, and their taped-together plasma rifles would simply drain their power cells trying to punch through it. Vance did not accept defeat. He closed his eyes, filtering out the ambient hum of the shield and the tense breathing of his crew. He accessed his own internal map, calling up the unredacted architectural schematics Kalen had risked his life to provide. Kalen was a perimeter guard. He understood the physical vulnerabilities of the ship, the blind spots, and the structural compromises the aristocratic engineers had made in the name of aesthetic beauty. Vance's eyes snapped open. He marched right up to the heavy obsidian paneling adorning the corridor walls just inches away from the projected energy barrier. He pointed a steady finger at a beautifully carved golden crest embedded in the dark stone. "Jax," Vance ordered, his voice echoing sharply, "tear that off the wall." The massive Martian cartel boss did not ask questions. He holstered his rifle, stepped up to the panel, and drove his thick fingers into the microscopic seam between the obsidian and the gold. With a guttural roar of raw, kinetic exertion, Jax ripped the heavy decorative crest entirely free, tossing the heavy metal slab onto the floor. Behind the beautiful facade lay the ugly, utilitarian truth of the ship's engineering. A series of thick, glowing crystalline tubes pulsed with rapid thermal energy. They were the localized heat sinks for the bridge's shield projectors. The Valyrian architects had hidden them behind decorative paneling because exposed plumbing was an offense to their refined sensibilities. The shield generator requires massive, instantaneous cooling to maintain its kinetic integrity, Vance explained rapidly, turning to his heavily armed strike team. If the localized heat sinks experience a catastrophic thermal spike, the automated safety protocols will forcibly sever the power connection to prevent the projectors from melting into slag. The system will initiate a hard reboot. When that happens, the shield drops. We will have exactly 4 seconds to cross the threshold before the secondary capacitors engage. He raised his modified, rapidly cycling plasma rifle and aimed it directly at the exposed crystalline tubes. "Light them up," Vance commanded. 5 of the convicts stepped forward, leveling their unstable weapons at the recess in the wall. They pulled the triggers, unleashing a sustained superheated barrage of blue plasma directly into the cooling system. They did not aim to destroy the tubes. They aimed to inject pure, overwhelming thermal energy into the closed loop. The temperature in the corridor skyrocketed instantly. The crystalline tubes shifted from a steady, cool blue to a violent, angry crimson. Deep within the bulkheads, heavy warning sirens began to wail. The automated system screamed in digital panic as the thermal load exceeded maximum safety parameters. To save itself from complete incineration, the Ethelguard's main computer executed the emergency failsafe. The impenetrable blue wall of kinetic energy violently collapsed, dissolving into a shower of harmless static sparks. "Move!" Vance roared. The inmates of Cell Block Alpha flooded through the massive blast doors like a tide of dirty, kinetic violence, pouring into a cathedral of alien opulence. The primary command bridge of the Ethelguard was a vast, multi-tiered amphitheater constructed of polished black stone, towering crystal viewing ports, and flowing banners of luminescent violet silk. It was a space designed to project absolute, unquestionable authorities, but right now it was a slaughterhouse. Commander Vael's personal Praetorian Guard, A dozen towering elites encased in heavy ceremonial armor formed a defensive perimeter around the central command throne. They raised their elegant, long-barreled weapons, expecting a disorganized mob. They fired highly accurate, devastating blasts of concentrated energy, but their cycle rates were agonizingly slow. Vance's crew hit the room in perfect tactical formation. They bounded over the glowing holographic navigation tables, using the heavy consoles as cover. The crude, bastardized human rifles roared, filling the pristine air with an overwhelming volume of suppressive fire. The sheer brute force mathematics of the engagement favored the humans. They fired twice as fast, laying down a blanket of heat that rapidly overwhelmed the Praetorians' defensive plating. Elena Rostova was a lethal phantom in the chaos. She completely bypassed the main firefight, using a downed silk banner to vault silently onto the upper observation tier. She dropped directly behind the heavy weapons operators who were desperately trying to manually track the invading convicts. She neutralized 3 Valyrian officers in less than 5 seconds, utilizing precise, crushing kinetic strikes to their unarmored cervical joints. She moved with absolute terrifying economy, ensuring the dreadnought's internal defense turrets remained firmly offline. Down on the main deck, the pristine beauty of the bridge was being rapidly shredded. Stray plasma bolts shattered the immense crystal displays, raining sharp, glittering shrapnel down on the panicked high-caste technicians. The violet silk banners caught fire, filling the vaulted ceiling with thick, acrid smoke. Jax took a glancing plasma bolt to his heavy left shoulder, the heat searing the thick fabric of his jumpsuit. He simply laughed, a harsh, brutal sound that echoed over the gunfire. He threw his empty rifle aside, lowered his shoulder, and physically tackled a towering Praetorian guard backward through a massive pane of decorative glass. The 2 massive combatants tumbled into the sunken sensor pit in a tangle of limbs and shattered armor. Commander Vael watched his absolute power evaporate in real time. His elite guards were falling. His beautiful bridge was burning. The beasts he had sought to enslave were systematically dismantling his command structure with terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency. Panicked and humiliated, Vael drew his ceremonial sidearm, a crackling blade of pure, contained energy. He leapt from his elevated command throne, intent on securing a glorious, honorable death by cutting down the human leader. He charged at Silas Vance, swinging the brilliant blade in a wide, devastating arc designed to cleave a man in 2. Vance did not fight with honor. He fought to win. He read the tension in the alien commander's shoulders and completely anticipated the strike. Vance simply stepped inside the arc of the blade, letting the deadly heat wash harmlessly past his face. He drove the heavy, reinforced butt of his modified rifle squarely into the center of Vael's ornate chest plate. The kinetic impact cracked the crystalline armor and forced the air from the commander's lungs. Before Vael could recover his balance, Vance swept his heavy boot hard against the back of the alien's knees. The great Commander Vael, the ambitious aristocrat who sought to enslave humanity, hit the polished obsidian deck with a heavy, unceremonious thud. His energy blade skittered uselessly across the floor. He tried to rise, his 4 eyes wide with shock and rage, but the superheated, tape-wrapped barrel of a human plasma rifle jammed brutally against his throat. Vance stood over him, his face covered in soot, sweat, and the harsh blue light of the bridge's emergency sirens. He looked down at the alien commander with absolute, withering contempt. The gunfire on the bridge abruptly died. The remaining Praetorian guards, seeing their absolute commander pinned to the deck like a common street thug, lowered their weapons. The human convicts immediately swarmed them, stripping them of their arms and forcing them to their knees. The capture was total. "You are a primitive beast," Vael spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and utter humiliation as he stared up at the scarred human. "You cannot possibly pilot this vessel." You will all burn in the void. I am a tactician, Vael, Vance replied quietly, pressing the hot barrel a fraction of an inch deeper into the alien's throat. And a tactician knows how to delegate. Relinquish the primary command codes. Vael hesitated, his aristocratic pride warring with his basic survival instincts. He looked at his burning bridge, at his defeated guards, and finally at the cold, dead eyes of Elena Rostova, who had just stepped out of the shadows, her hands dripping with Valerian blue blood. The commander's resolve shattered completely. In a quiet, broken whisper, Vael spoke a rapid sequence of native syllables. The dreadnought's central artificial intelligence hummed to life, its flat, synthesized voice echoing through the smoke-filled chamber. Command transfer recognized. Primary systems unlocked. Awaiting directives. Vance stepped back, allowing his enforcers to drag the weeping, defeated commander to his feet and secure his hands behind his back. The absolute authority of the Valerian Empire had been broken by 50 outcasts from the dirt. They owned the Ethel Guard, but their victory was abruptly overshadowed by a massive blaring klaxon from the central navigation console. Doctor! Thorne slid into the primary pilot's seat, her hands flying across the unfamiliar alien interface as she rapidly deciphered the incoming telemetry data. Silas! Thorne called out, her voice tight with genuine anxiety. The Inquisitor's dreadnought just dropped its cloaking field. They are in visual range. They have locked their heavy plasma batteries onto our hull. If we do not return the correct Imperial countersign in exactly 60 seconds, they are going to vaporize this entire sector. Vance looked at the massive main viewing port, where the sleek, terrifying silhouette of a fully armed Imperial warship was blotting out the stars. They had successfully stolen the most powerful weapon in the quadrant, but none of them knew how to fly it, and the executioner had just arrived at the door. An empty throne is just a piece of furniture until a king actually sits on it. For the first time in its long, golden history, the command seat of the Ethel Guard belonged to a man who had crawled his way up from the absolute bottom of the universe. But Silas Vance had exactly 1 minute to enjoy the view before the entire ship was reduced to atomic dust. The massive main viewing port of the bridge displayed a terrifying reality. The Imperial Inquisition vessel had completely dropped its cloaking field, revealing a jagged obsidian monolith that dwarfed even the Ethel Guard. It was a ship designed entirely for planetary subjugation and absolute orbital bombardment, pulsing with an angry crimson energy signature. They have locked their heavy plasma batteries onto our central drive core. Doctor, Eris Thorne reported, her fingers flying across the glowing alien interface of the pilot's console. The Inquisitor is demanding the encrypted daily countersign. If I do not transmit the correct algorithmic response in 40 seconds, they will open fire and vaporize this entire grid sector. Vance did not panic. A tactician lives in the compressed seconds between life and death. He walked over to where Commander Vael was kneeling on the shattered glass of his own bridge, his hands bound tightly behind his back by jacks. Vael was weeping quietly, his aristocratic pride completely broken by the brutal reality of his defeat. Get him on his feet, Vance ordered. Jax hauled the alien commander upward, gripping him tightly by the heavy collar of his ruined ceremonial armor. Vance picked up the crackling, concentrated energy blade Vael had dropped moments earlier. He activated the weapon, the hum of the blade cutting through the tense silence of the room. He stepped entirely out of the visual range of the primary communication sensor, leaving only Vael in the frame. Vance pressed the searing heat of the energy blade directly against the base of Vael's spine, just enough to singe the fabric of his uniform. Open a direct visual channel to the Inquisition vessel, Vance commanded Thorne. He route the audio solely through Vael's localized comlink. The central holographic projector flared to life, replacing the tactical map with the towering, terrifying visage of the Imperial Inquisitor. He wore heavy robes of dark crimson, his four eyes narrowing in intense suspicion as he surveyed Commander Vael. The Inquisitor could not see the human convicts hiding behind the ruined consoles, nor could he see the energy blade resting against Vael's back. He only saw a commander standing on a bridge filled with thick smoke and flickering emergency lights. "Commander Vael," the Inquisitor's voice boomed, a harsh, grinding sound that shook the deck plating. "Your vessel is unresponsive to standard algorithmic pings. Your bridge is venting atmospheric smoke. Transmit the countersign immediately or be purged." Behind the projector's visual field, Vance leaned in close to Vael's ear. "Tell him you suffered a catastrophic thermal containment failure in the lower foundries," Vance whispered, his voice a promise of absolute violence. "Tell him the human beasts ignited the plasma lines and perished in the fire. Tell him you are initiating an emergency, unplotted slipspace jump to vent the volatile core radiation into the void before the ship detonates." Vael swallowed hard, feeling the blistering heat of the blade against his spine. He looked at the terrifying Inquisitor on the screen, caught between the wrath of his own empire and the immediate, lethal intent of the human holding the sword. "Basic survival instincts 1. Lord Inquisitor," Vael stammered, managing to summon a fraction of his former aristocratic arrogance. "We have suffered a catastrophic thermal breach in the lower foundries. The primitive beasts we acquired managed to ignite the secondary cooling lines through sheer, ignorant incompetence. They have all perished in the ensuing fire." The Inquisitor sneered, a look of profound disgust crossing his alien features. "A predictable outcome for dealing with unrefined biological matter. And the smoke on your bridge. A localized ventilation backfire," Vael lied, his voice trembling slightly. "The core is currently highly volatile. I am initiating an immediate, unplotted slipspace translation to vent the dangerous radiation safely into the deep void. I respectfully request you stand clear of our acceleration wake." "Lord Inquisitor." The Inquisitor paused, analyzing the tactical variables. The arrogance of the explanation perfectly matched the standard operating procedure of a careless Border Patrol aristocrat. Convinced he was dealing with incompetence rather than a hostile takeover, the Inquisitor scoffed. "Very well, Commander, vent your radiation. We will rendezvous at the designated Imperial outpost for a full formal audit of your sheer incompetence." "Inquisition out!" The holographic projection severed, returning the bridge to the dim, smoky blue of the emergency lighting. The massive Inquisition warship slowly banked away on the main viewing port, clearing the immediate flight path. "Thorn," Vance said, deactivating the energy blade and tossing it onto the floor. "Jump coordinates? Anywhere but here," Thorn replied, a fierce predatory grin spreading across her face. She slammed her hand down on the primary acceleration throttle, entirely bypassing the Ethelguard's navigational safety limiters. The Dreadnought's massive sublight engines roared to life, generating an immense wave of kinetic force that pinned everyone on the bridge to the floor. Outside the viewing port, the fabric of space literally tore open, creating a swirling, violent tunnel of brilliant blue light. The Ethelguard surged forward, slipping the bonds of normal space and vanishing into the limitless expanse of the hyperspace corridor. They left the Imperial Inquisitor staring at an empty patch of stars, entirely unaware that the deadliest warship in his fleet now belonged to humanity. The violent vibration of the jump smoothed out, replaced by the deep, rhythmic, comforting hum of the slipspace drive. They had done it. They were safe. They were free. The heavy adrenaline of the prolonged assault finally began to fade. The 50 convicts of Cell Block Alpha picked themselves up off the polished obsidian floor. They were a ruined, beautiful mess. They were covered in grease, soot, and the bright blue blood of their alien captors. Their crude, tape-wrapped plasma rifles were overheated and smoking. Jax was sitting on the steps of the command platform, using his teeth to tighten a makeshift bandage around his severely burned shoulder, chuckling darkly to himself. Elena Rostova leaned against a shattered crystal display, calmly ejecting the spent thermal magazine from her weapon, her pale eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. Silas Vance walked to the center of the ruined bridge. He looked at the magnificent, arrogant architecture of the Valyrian Empire, now heavily scarred by human violence. He looked at his crew, the outcasts, the murderers, and the disgraced tacticians that Earth had tried to bury in the dark. Earth built the Tartarus transport to be our permanent tomb, Vance said, his deep, resonant voice easily cutting through the ambient hum of the engines. The convicts stopped what they were doing and turned to face him. Earth politicians branded us monsters and threw us into the darkest corner of the galaxy they could find, hoping we would simply erase each other. The Valyrian Empire looked at us and saw nothing but cheap, disposable meat for their plasma furnaces. They thought they could put collars on our necks, hand us shovels, and break our spirits in the heat. Vance paced slowly across the deck, making eye contact with the hardened criminals who had trusted him enough to charge into the fire. Both of them made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that when you take the most dangerous predators in the galaxy and lock them inside a single cage, they do not turn into sheep. They learn how to hunt as a pack. Look around you. You are standing on the bridge of the most advanced, heavily armed warship in this sector. You did not ask for your freedom today. You took it from them with your bare hands and a few pieces of scrap metal. A low, dangerous murmur of agreement swept through the crew. From this exact moment forward, the criminal codes and the life sentences of Earth mean absolutely nothing, Vance declared, his tone ringing with absolute unyielding authority. The rigid hierarchy and the grand ambitions of the Valyrian Empire mean nothing. We answer to no corrupt government, and we bow to no arrogant emperor. We are a sovereign faction. We are the kings of the void, and this entire galaxy is about to find out exactly what happens when you accidentally leave the cage door open. A massive, resounding cheer erupted from the 50 convicts. It was a raw, guttural roar of pure triumph, a vicious declaration of existence that echoed through the vast, empty halls of their new golden fortress. They were no longer prisoners, and they were no longer slaves. They were the masters of their own terrifying destiny. Vance stepped down from the central platform, meeting Dr. Eris Thorne halfway. The silver neural threads on her temples glowed softly in the blue light of the hyperspace tunnel. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the heavy layer of soot from the collar of his uniform. The quiet, unspoken romance between them was no longer a desperate clinging in the absolute dark. It was a partnership forged in the fires of a highly successful rebellion. "So, Admiral," Thorne drawled, her cynical voice carrying a genuine note of warmth, "where exactly are we taking this stolen luxury vehicle?" Vance looked out the massive viewing port at the swirling blue tunnel of infinite possibilities. "Everywhere," Vance replied. The Ethelguard sailed endlessly into the light, carrying a crew of unbreakable human monsters toward an uncharted universe. Thank you all so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed this fast-paced journey into the dark corners of the galaxy, please hit that hype button right now so this video can reach more sci-fi fans just like you. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share the video with your friends to help the channel grow. I want to know who made it all the way to the very end of this adventure. So leave the word sovereign in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.